Hi there, this is Stefano Ritteri. We are in my studio in Brick Lane, London, and we are, with a blank project in Cubase, which is what happens every day, here and every night. And yeah, I'm just gonna start playing around with some instruments and some effects and show you a bit how I work. Well, I started making music a long time ago, and funnily enough, I have started with Cubase. It was the first program because a friend of mine had a copy of it. I think it was still Cubase VST or like even before SX. So we're talking about many years ago. And at the time I was in a band, so I was really into the whole, I would play drums and guitar and piano, and my long hair and my heavy metal looks were the thing of the moment. But then when I started going raving, I had this friend of mine, and he was, at the time, he was producing drum and bass, and I used to go to his house and try to learn Cubase at the very beginning, and then I got myself a copy, and I remember like being very excited and going home and installing it in my super old PC at home, and I couldn't get any sounds out of it. So I had to call my friend, and he had to come over and explain to me that Cubase by itself, it didn't have sounds. I had to record or use something with it. So fast forwarding, sometime after that, me and this guy got a studio together, which was mostly a garage. We started getting really into this thing and buying loads of hardware. At the time, plugins weren't really reliable, and the computer wasn't very powerful. So we started buying loads of synthesizers and EQs and compressors and stuff. And so Cubase was mostly a recorder, really. It was mostly a MIDI recorder, like a MIDI sequencer, and eventually would record the master out of our 16 tracks mixer. And since then, I've been always using Cubase. Then when I started, I did study sound engineering and music productions many years ago as well. And so I had to learn, for some exams, I had to learn other programs such as Logic and Pro Tools and a bit of Ableton Live when it was at the very, very, very start of Ableton. And now when I'm collaborating with people, it happens sometimes that I go to someone else's studio and they're using something else. And to be honest, I find myself pretty comfortable using also other softwares. But for me personally, my weapon is Cubase, because I know how to use it now for many, many years. And since 3 or 4 years, the guys have been very supporting with me, the guys at Steinberg, and they're always sending me updates and stuff before they're out, so I can try them out and I can give them my humble feedback. And for me, it's always very exciting to see what they're coming up every year. I think they're really pushing the bar really, really high every year. They have some new functions, and even though I still use Cubase in a very old school way somehow, like I've done for years, every now and then my good friend at Steinberg comes in the studio and he shows me something new, and that makes my life much easier. And so it's been really exciting, particularly in the last few years, because as I said, they've been very supportive with me, and they're giving me lots of things to play around. So I always start with this blank project. So it's not very. Some people find this a bit scary to have a blank project. For me, it's actually very very opening, in a creative way. So I don't know. Sometimes I would load in a sample. I'm gonna import some percussions. Let's see. Yeah, for example, this one. I don't know, the first one that comes in my head. I copy it. The time is 120, the tempo, I think it's fine. Right, so first sample, it's gonna, obviously this is a conga sample, and it would drive me in some direction probably. What I would do, first thing first, I would open something on my master bus, not really for a sound purpose, but more as a security for because especially when I'm loading in samples or creating bass lines or stuff, I tend to play really loud, and I don't like digital distortion. So what would I do is I tend to have different chains for different projects. Sometimes I mix on the go when I'm creating the record. Some other times, especially when I'm working with somebody else, we send sessions back and forward, and then I'm normally the one in charge of mixing, because I'm really, really peculiar about the mixing, and I love the process of getting nerdy and playing around with mixing tools. So eventually I would replace some plugins or create different chains. But normally what I have on my stereo out chain is it's a very simple chain of effects. I would start normally with a compressor, just to make sure that my peaks don't get out of control. I'm liking a lot the vintage compressor. It's a clear emulation of 1176, from Universal Audio. It's a classic compressor. It's famous for being really, really fast and having a pretty gritty tone if you drive it. And it's a very, very fast attack and release compressor. And it's been emulated many times. I have the emulations from UAD. I have, different emulations of this. But I find these emulations actually working pretty well as a very good sonic character. And the way I normally set it up is I tend to have the attack around 30 milliseconds. So I let some of the transients of sounds pass. And wait, let me play it. And then the release as fast as possible, because this is a dance track, and in dance music I'm not really bothered about a consistent about being gentle and musical. I like to have a pretty consistent sound. Dynamics in dance records are very relative, because ultimately you have to sound as good and as loud as the record you're going to play before and after. So there is really not much space for dynamic. And if it was an orchestra recording or a pop record, then we would have some space. But in this case I tend to set it up. Obviously now we only have one sound going on, so the compressor is barely moving, but if I would push it a bit more, you could start feeling a bit the character of it. And one nice thing I like to do is obviously you play around with the ratio and you see what works best. I tend to leave it at 2 because it's pretty soft in a way, and sometimes I add the punch, which is the emulation of that distortion circuit that the 1176 has, and that with the original unit you would need to press all the buttons in at the same time, which is the all-in button trick, which has been used in countless records, which is not exactly how you're supposed to use the original unit. In fact, it's not really good. Like, you actually feel a bit bad in doing it because it makes a weird sound. But if you do it, basically you engage a sort of a feedback in, and you have a distortion on top of the compression, which in this case I can just press punch, and then the attack mode gets into this little feedback mode and gets a bit more beefy. So that would be always the first thing in my master chain, my master bus. Followed, depends really, but I like to switch things as well. Followed sometimes by actually a UAD Pultec emulation, because I just leave it on. I find it gives a certain character to the sound, and so I don't really touch it. The only thing I do sometimes is I try to attenuate the high frequencies. I really think that some plugins and some samples, they have too much high frequency content, so I normally shave it off from every single sound in a later stage, but I like to do it straight away from the master as well to make it sound a bit more vintage if you want. So I just put in the attenuation on the 20K and just attenuate 3 and 4. As you can hear on this particular loop, it doesn't really make anything, but if I would start playing hi-hats or vocals, it could really take off some of the harshness of the digital records. And it's a very gentle curve, and that's why the Pultec, the original hardware, is still very expensive, because it has very gentle curves and a very, very strong character to it at the same time. So sometimes I use it to boost the bass. It's really beautiful what it does on the bass, but most of the times I don't touch it on the master. I just literally shave off some of the high frequencies. And after that, I tried to use, there was an old plugin which was Magneto, which disappeared from Cubase for a long time, and now it's back. It's back from version 7.5, and it's just a tape simulation. What tape does, we all know that tape kind of creates a warmer sound, and if you push it really hard, it tends to somehow work as a compressor as well, because it gets the transient really squashed in. And doing that, obviously the dynamics are compromised, but at the same time the warmth of single sounds or the whole masters, it gets warmer, it gets a bit better, it gets a bit more distorted. And because I used to work with analog mixers for many years, I like to hear that hiss, that distortion in my records, even if it's all in the box. So the way Magneto works is pretty simple, really. You just select the saturation, and obviously it works best when you're mixing and when multiple sounds are there. That's when you really hear it work at work, and then you can select different filtering. You can tell it not to work below a certain frequency or above a certain frequency, so you can distort only certain range. And something really interesting is to use it in dual mode. Dual mode is an old trick trick that you could use in the analog stuff and in some virtual stuff as well. Basically, some compressors, some bus compressors or distortion units, when you have the ability to work in dual mode, it means that the left and right channels are treated separately, are treated in different ways, which creates a difference compared to when you actually use it in single mode. Because in single mode, you would get the stereo signal, and in this case, distorted and compress it all in one. Whereas working in dual mode, you would get the different nuances of the sound. So if I have some sounds, panned in my final mix, for example, say that I have a very loud conga or a very loud synth line only on my left speaker because I wanted to have his own position there, the left part of the tape would distort more in that very moment than the right part, creating a better stereo effect. So lots of units, lots of hardware units have this mode, this possibility of working dual mode, which somehow it creates an effect of better spacing. If you're working with hard panned stuff, I find that the dual mode retains this information a bit better than working with just one distortion unit on it. So the fact that they've added this mode in Magneto, I find it really good. And again, when I start a record, I just turn it on because I know straight away I want to have some distortion, and then I might add more and more also on drum basses or on single instruments if I want, especially on bass lines and stuff. I tend to open many of them. Also, it's pretty light on the CPU, so I tend to open many of them and just crank them up and see how distorted can I go before it sounds like a heavy metal record. And even if it sounds like a heavy metal record, sometimes it's good. So that would be my change. Sometimes I like to add a plugin which I find to work really, really well, and it's very simple, is the stereo enhancer. Like there are many ways of doing this. Isotope, many plugins work on the stereo image, and you tend to use them at the very end or at the mastering stage to put even more space in between the speakers, in between the sounds when you're panning them. What can happen is that if you overdo it, you can have phase problems, which is basically when, if you have a phase problem on one sound, it means that it will sound beautiful in your headphones or in your speakers, and you can, show off with your friends about how far apart your sounds are, or the soundscape is beautiful and wide, but then you go and play that record in a club where most sound systems are mono, and then you're going to lose most of the informations of that sound, which means, in a few words, it means that sound is going to sound really bad in the club or very, very low in volume. So in order to avoid that, I tend to have a spectrum analyzer and a phase analyzer always on, so I can play it and see exactly what it is, and see that where this sound is sounding like. I can see that it's pretty panned, but as long as the phase analyzer doesn't go below 0, it means that I can mono my signal in my monitor controller and I would still be able to hear it. So when playing with stereo enhancers from every brand, I always have to have a look at that and make sure that my master doesn't go below the 0. Otherwise, the mastering engineer will have to correct that by applying elliptical EQ, which is a corrective EQ which you can apply on the mastering stage, and basically you can tell that below a certain frequency the information becomes mono. So a mastering engineer would have to see where it's the problem, what sound is creating this problem of phase problem, and go from that frequency below, go mono. So whatever you've done, to pan and everything will be kind of lost, or your reverbs or effects will be kind of lost. So it's better to always keep an eye on every single sound and try to correct the phase problems in the mix, so the mastering engineer doesn't have to go too heavy on that. And in this case, what I do is I normally load the stereo enhancer, and here you go. You have a preset called Dance Master. It's fairly simple. I just leave it on like this without adding too much, but I just find that it gives my final mix a bit more openness, which I like. And then obviously I will work on that during the mix by careful panning and some other tricks like short delays on the left and right, and other mixing tricks that I'm applying on the record. But let's say that this is normally what I would have always open on my master. And then obviously sometimes I use different plugins, sometimes I use UID ones. But again, I find that the plugins of the new Cubase plugins sound pretty good to me, and they're very, very light on the CPU. So I can go really heavy and try things. So that would be my, my normal chain. When I started, getting interested in electronic music, and I was 16, 17. As I said, I always wanted to have a music career, you know. I studied music all my life. Since I was 3 years old, all my life I studied instruments and I had bands. And when electronic music became part of my life, production and going to parties, I started also DJing at some small parties in Rome. And then after that, I was very lucky. I started DJing a lot, and DJing became my main income already when I was 19 or 20. So I started thinking, right, how do I push this even forward, you know? And I was always opening, for example, for famous acts, and you know, having long conversations with them at dinner about how would they make those records that I was playing, you know. And I was really a fan, and I wanted to learn and learn and learn. And I've always wanted this to be, you know, my life. And probably the moment where I thought, okay, this has to be it, is when I decided to move from Rome to London, you know, because in Rome I had at the time, you know, by that time I had already my 3rd or 4th studio, and it was really a paradise. It was fully analog. I had modular stuff. I had every classic synth you can imagine. You know, all the money I was making from DJing were spent in the studio. So you name it, you know, 303, 909, Moogs, modular synths, everything was, every month I was buying myself a new toy, even too much, because I wasn't really learning them. I was just collecting them because at the time, you know, you needed the hardware. So the more, the better. And then when I moved to London, I thought, right, I'm moving to London. I need to make it, you know. I'm in the city where most of my heroes are. And obviously I found out how difficult it was, you know, how many good producers are out there, how many good DJs are out there. So I had to scale everything back in, you know. I had to sell some stuff to support myself. And more then I moved towards a software period, where now I'm moving back to a hardware period. But basically I would say that when I moved to London was really when I thought, right, now I moved, because it's not that I moved to London and I said, let's see. I took everything I had in Rome, all my studio stuff, all of my records, all of my clothes and everything. I put them in a van, shipped them to London, and that was it, never to come back. So that was probably for me the moment where I said, now I really have to make it, you know, now there is no coming back. It took a couple of years since I moved to London, you know, to start having shows and, you know, having some records that people started to play. And then now, you know, you know, I've been in the game now for 5 or 6 years, and, you know, touring and, you know, happy to be in this game and still loving it, yeah. And then I would start playing with sounds. I would, you know, like, this triggers many ideas to me. Like I could add some kicks or some stuff. I could open, I don't know, Groove Agent or Machine or whatever it is. Let's open Groove Agent. Here you go. And maybe we can load some kits. 8-bit. Maybe not the 8-bit. I don't know. Whatever, like really now it's just to write the ideas. Right, so this is it. This is on my C, so I would just let it go for a bit and play. And then decide what MPC quantize I want to have, which for me sounds always good. So normally I start with something fairly simple, like a 56 or a 54, which means my sound is not going to be exactly on the grid, but has a little shuffle. So I apply Q as many times as I want to make the kick, you know, kind of staying on the beat. And then, for example, I can hear that there is some difference in between the way that they recorded this drum loop and my kick. So what I can do, because this is already a Rex file and it's just simply a box or a part of you know, single events, I can just select it and apply the quantize. In this case, I can try to apply the same quantize as the kick. So somehow they are on the same vibe. Then I can either record on this part, or what would I do is I would open another MIDI part, or as many as I want, so then I can edit the single sounds, you know. And again, I apply the same quantize. At least at the beginning, I try to make them sound like the groove as locked as possible. just to have, you know, a simple group to start playing with, and then I start having a look. I have a look at my master there to see that, you know, I'm not pushing things. Well, it is compressing just a little, you know, 1 or 2 dBs, so it's not too bad. But already if I take it off, the groove and the vibe of just the drums changes, because as I said, the 1176 is a very colorful compressor. You know, it has a certain tone to it. So I like to use it not just to keep the transient in place, but also to actually change my grooves. So obviously now we can hear the pumping effect because I'm not giving any gain afterwards, so we can hear it pumping. So what I would do is I would see how much I'm compressing, in this case a bit less than 3 dBs, and then give it back. I try to match the sound, the volume when it's on and off, so I can hear only if the compression is doing the right job. It is. Like I could feel it, you know, it's compressing a very little, but it already gives a little bit of a movement because the release makes it pumping. And again, I wouldn't do this if this was a different record, but because it's a dance record. And then, I don't know, like, then normally I just, either I add some other samples to it, or I can load some other instrument. I don't know, for example, I tend to use Retrolog quite a lot. It has a good vibe. Pretty old school. Okay. Actually, let me create a longer loop. Just by doubling it. That's the beauty of working with parts, that, you know, everything is always in blocks. So, you know, if I want to record like a super long thing from my synths or MIDI, I don't have to record loops and be worried. I just copy it for whatever amount of bars and I can play with it. And, you know, it's simple controls, Control D, you know, and you know, it's good that you can make your own shortcuts, really, because I tend to spend some time to make my own shortcuts, so I barely have to look at things or use menus, you know. And obviously, like every other program, Cubase is very cool in the fact that you can make your own, and then you can save them as presets, which I've done already 2-3 versions ago. So when I'm when I'm using some new program, I can just import my preferences file, and it's all saved, you know, from many versions ago. You know, the colors you want to use, the quantize, you know, how you want to look at the windows. If, you know, you can save workspaces, so you can have only the mixer view when you're mixing, or, you know, the arranger. Or it's really cool that you can save everything basically in one preference file. So then I keep it always saved somewhere. And also, you know, I have the same Cubase and stuff in my laptop for when I'm traveling or working in someone else's studio, and it looks exactly like this. And my preferences and my shortcuts are all saved within, you know, Cubase. So that's pretty quick. And yeah, so I don't know. I want to record in live. I like to start just with, you know, with the main, and that's when most of my friends are leaving, because then we will hear this for hours and hours until I find the tone that I like. I think they really managed to capture a bit of grit to it, especially when you start adding the distortion. And then, you know, you start playing around with modulations. adding the LFO. I try sometimes not to use the sync in LFOs or in anything. I like, you know, to keep it a bit like the old machines where you had to go by ear and then, you know, sometimes it will go off from the grid, but whatever, you know, it makes it a bit fun. And so, yeah, I mean, and then again, you know, I would just play with the bass line, but then maybe adding some other sample, you know, you change it, obviously, you know, this is just a basic idea. Or some other times, I don't even write bass lines, I go for the randomness of my favorite MIDI insert. Either, you know, you can use Arpash, which is an arpeggiator and is really good fun, or, you know, the Step Designer, which has the beauty of the random. So now it's obviously the LFO is creating this weirdness. So this Step Designer is giving the MIDI notes, and then the LFO, if I take it off, it will be like this. And then you can go in negative or in positive and add the modulations of the cutoff. So this is in positive, I don't like it. So where you go back, and it's a reversed envelope triggered by the LFO. Yes, and after a good 4 or 5 hours of tweaking this, what I like to do, for example, once I find, I don't know, I might load just a random sample. I don't know. This is my selection. I tend to spend the first month of every year, you know, going through my samples, sampling loads of vinyls, and then putting everything separated in folders. I think organization is key when you're a super nerd and you start having terabytes and terabytes of samples. So, for example, I don't know, let's say I load any sample. I don't know what this is, actually, this must be very old. For example, I don't know, I'll go random, like I like the A jangling guy at the beginning. And I don't know, I can see what happens if I really pitch it down. One thing I like to use a lot is, I misuse it really because that's not what you're supposed to use it for, but the pitch correct. It's pretty fun because, you know, it's supposed to, you know, you put it on some beautiful vocal that your perfect singer has recorded for you and giving you a good 70 tracks of the same verse. And then when you find the good one by comping it and see, you know, finally having one, you can still have some problems, you know, in the pitch on certain parts. Not because of the singer, of course, it's normally you that you put the microphone wrong or something like that. So when they leave the room, you can turn these on and you correct, you know, and you make it, you know, that very note, you can correct it in many different ways, really. You can go in the file and, you know, and you can go in Vari Audio, and then he analyzes it, and then you have all the notes of, you know, and I could... You know, this works best if I don't pitch it from here. So if I leave this how it is, you could hear that it's... So I can... It analyzes everything as it is. So... So it becomes more as a... whatever, as a... almost an effect. So when that is done, I tend to apply the pitch correct as well. And instead of using it like you're supposed to do, like you know what note you're working in your key, whatever, and then you start tweaking it and you optimize it for man or girl, you know. What I do is I completely play around with it. So I don't really know what tolerance or this stuff do, but I just play around with it for hours and hours until I have something that doesn't sound like maybe low. And as you can see, like I can still play around with it or go back to hit points. I put my threshold down so it creates 4 parts of this. I create events, so it's chopped, and I can quantize this. Sometimes you use a whole acapella and then that's all you end up using, but and then I don't know, maybe I like to work a lot. For example, one thing that I like to do is I put guitar rig on pretty much everything from native instrument because it's you can really take something and make something else with it. I never use it on guitars or something like that, actually. I just use it, I don't know, I just fire up some... Here you go, you have effects for days. And then if I want that to repeat, instead of having to think about too much, I create a part. And I put it with with the bar and everything, right? I put it so it's it's always a loop, and I can just copy it a few other times, and it's always at the same place. And then I would do this randomly for many times. And then one thing I like to use a lot in the creative process is to use FX channels, because basically, like with FX channels, again, you can make stuff which is not supposed to happen. Like, for example, if I go in my mixer, I could, where is it? Where is my effects? I just created it and I can't see it. It's pretty good. Let me take off the audio. That's another thing I like in Cubase. If it gets messy with 1 million tracks, you can just go in your mix console and switch off whatever you don't want to see. Here we go. So I don't want to see the rewire channels. I don't want to see the inputs. Here you go. So I create another effects channel. Here we go. And I don't know, for example, I like to load from UAD the Roland, this reminds me of the good old times. And again, I would just put some completely random effects, open my send on that beautiful vocal snippet that we just created, and then see what happens if I... And I hear what it does. So now it's creating this, which is, your typical Roland Space Echo sound, So what would I do is, because I would like to be like Lee Scratch Perry, what I would do is I would fire it up very high on my send, so there is a big portion of this sample going in the Space Echo. And one thing I like to do a lot is leave it on and then automate the repeat rate, which is very simple because I can just press right like in everything else in Cubase, and do this. That's it. And now, when it goes back, and sometimes I you know, with something like this simple, sometimes on, oh hello, sometimes on the right stab, on the right sound, it can actually, you know, if sometimes I want to make records which are, you know, a bit simpler, like when I find the right bass line a bit better than this one, when I find the right groove, I don't want to add layers and layers. I'm trying, you know, the more I'm progressing as a producer, the more I'm really using less and less. And sometimes an effect like this, done with the space echo or whatever other delay or reverb, for example, automating a delay or a reverb, it's really, you know, it really fills up 32 bars of a record where otherwise I would have to think about, oh, I want, you know, it's too empty here, it's too repetitive, I need something else. So what I try to do is when I record synth lines, when I record the Korg Volcas, when I record the Brute, or even a MIDI, you know, instrument like Retrolog or whatever, or Diva, I try to, when I have the basic idea for like 16 bars or whatever, then I would just, I don't know, I would just copy these. You can use the arranger track, but in this sense, I'm a bit more old school. I just make sure that my, you know, that everything is right on the bar, you know, at the beginning and at the end. So if I copy it, I don't have weirdness. And then, you know, I just copy it for sections. And then when, you know, when I have the right groove, when I feel that the song is there, and then I just put the long loop, and then I start, all right, let's start playing around with the bass, and I automate the filter, or I record the Mini Brute live, a long 20-minute take, and then I take the best parts where I didn't go too crazy with the resonance, and then, you know, that becomes part of the record. Or I do different automations. Like I like to write everything, like to play the song from bar 0 until the end 10 times and do these sorts of automations or closing and opening filters. And so the record, oh hello, this is a good thing about the Space Echo, it's never sleeping. And then basically, you know, and then when it's there, when I've done a few takes of whatever it is that I need, then I find it pretty simple to do structures, because then, you know, I look where I am on my timeline. Here it's 5 minutes. So let's say that this was a song, not just a simple groove. And I would know that, you know, my records normally are in between 6 minutes and 8 or 9 minutes if I'm really in a techno mode. And I would know, for example, that I would play then the song from the beginning after a drink or two, and I would imagine myself playing it, and I would be like, all right, okay. And while all these automations are working, and while my audio files are comped and they're all different, then I find myself, you know, just deleting the kick here, deleting the hi-hat. Okay, that's a breakdown, but it comes very naturally for me. I don't like to calculate. Some people are very good at this. Some people are thinking, okay, up to 33 is the intro, 33 I've got the bass line coming, whatever, you know, 65 is the little break, 97 is the main break. I don't do that. Or I used to do that in the past. Now I try to have the perfect groove for myself in 32 or 64 bars, and then copy it and then record all different versions of that groove. And when everything is moving and automated, you know, with effects and craziness, then I just have to play the record to myself a few times, and muting and unmuting stuff, sometimes in machine, sometimes in the audio tracks. And by doing that a few times, I have an arrangement done. So it's a bit more random, it's a bit more fun, and ultimately it's all about having fun.